Hello and welcome to another episode of Time Extend. My name is Adam Ismail, and as always, today I am joined by
Brendan Norrison, and Adam, we're finally back talking some Sega racers, and it's one that, to be honest, I'm surprised we haven't talked about that much. We are, of course, going to be talking about Outrun 2 or Outrun 2006, depending on what your exposure to this title was.
Yeah, the whole Outrun 2 sort of lineage spans many different pieces of hardware and many different releases. But yeah, this is a very popular Sega racer. You know, I think one of the last, maybe the last great Sega arcade racer, and one that we've never really discussed much. And although it might be sacrilegious to say, and we'll get into it, I do have kind of a complicated relationship with Outrun 2 and 2006 because they're great games. They're just like they're not really racing games. They're a different sort of thing, and so like I don't really put them in the same place as like a Daytona or a Sega Rally or a Scud Race because like to me they're a different thing. But what they are is still very just a very blissful, just fun, relaxing experience, and there are no other racing games like Outrun 2. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's probably more accurate to call it a driving game more than anything, because to be honest, as far as the racing goes, obviously it's in here as we'll go on to discuss, but I've never really felt that's the showstopper, racing other people, that type of thing. I think Outrun 2 and 2006, 2SP, whatever, it's always been more about that journey of driving these cars across incredible vistas and doing very strange requests that your girlfriend asks for along the way. It's a game, and it's a game that really has no direct comparison. I think a lot of companies have tried to emulate what Outrun brings to the table, but as we'll discuss today, I just feel as if this title does so much well that going back to it is always a treat, and I think that's why it's almost ironic, I suppose, that it's twinned with such a strange license in Ferrari that makes it like a game that will probably not return in the near future, I would guess. But I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's so great to return to this one specifically, because I still think it holds up more than enough.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a timeless game, and I think there's a reason why, although Outrun 2 wasn't, these kinds of arcade games, even the late 2000s, were not really the most, sort of fashionable, exciting thing. This game, I think, probably more than any other Sega racer, developed a real cult following because I think it really appealed to people who wanted a game that was just about the journey and just the fun of just driving through these like locales, so many different locales, wind in your hair, girl by your side, just that sort of atmosphere is not something that any other racing game has provided. And so I think you still hear people today just sort of talk about Outrun 2 in like a very misty-eyed way. And it's funny because we've seen so many, sort of independently developed racing games that try to go back to the 90s and cultivate some of that lost sort of flavor in the genre. But Outrun 2 is still kind of its own thing. There's never really been anything like it. So with that said, we can probably just set up some background about this game. And the funny thing about Outrun is that like there were so many releases in this franchise, I guess if you could call it, between the original back in the mid 80s all the way up until Outrun 2. You had Turbo Outrun and 2019 and Outrunners, and games that honestly I have not really ever played because I just either have not seen them in arcades or I didn't have a Genesis back in the day, so they're sort of lost to me. But then in 2003, you get Outrun 2. So in a way, it almost invalidates all of those games that came before, which is kind of, a shame because, like, I've never played like 2019 or Turbo, but I know that Outrunners is, I've seen footage of Outrunners, and it's a really cool looking game, and that game has like an awesome soundtrack. So, you know, in a way, it's almost like a slight that's like, yeah, just pretend all those other games didn't exist. This is a real sequel.
Yeah, it's pretty odd, because I think it's one of those ones as well where the fact that they weren't kind of directly numbered as sequels tells a story as well, because I mean, there's a direct kind of evolution of the concept between the original Outrun and Outrun 2, I suppose, whereas with those other ones it was more an exploration of how that kind of concept of gameplay could be advanced, like kind of technological advancements, that type of thing. Whereas I think like Outrun 2 deserves the moniker. I think it does try and kind of say, what can we do with this concept we had originally, and it obviously did that job pretty well, because it isn't uncommon to see people say, you know what, I don't have much time for the original Outrun, I don't really get what makes it great, but Outrun 2 just struck a chord with me. And I think that type of attitude shows that Outrun 2 was able to kind of take the concept and put it in a different format. And although I think we'll get onto this at some point as well, the gameplay in 2 is very streamlined and almost simplistic in nature, especially when the original is still so incredibly challenging today. But I think there was like a really good reason to take that type of idea of driving the journey and put it in a package that everybody is able to experience, but not everybody will be able to master in the typical arcade style.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's a game that everyone can enjoy. You know, this is when you try to look into the history of this game, you know, I actually was not able to find a ton on the AM2 side, but thankfully the folks from Sumo who worked on this game have been featured in a number of interviews, and they can sort of lend their perspective to it. And one of the quotes I actually want to start with actually is, it would seem like it's kind of in the weeds because it deals with the Ferrari license and stuff, but I think it perfectly speaks to why Outrun 2 was such a success in terms of achieving what it set out to, and why people love it so much. And it's a quote from a Rock Paper Shotgun interview. Steve Lysette, who was one of the producers on the game from the Sumo side, was talking about how they were able to get Ferrari to not only, you know, Sega obviously already had the Ferrari license from dealing with them with the original arcade game, but for Outrun 2006, they wanted to add a number of modified cars to the game. And so Lysette's talking about it, and he says that they were kind of expecting Ferrari to be like, no, you can't offer tuned versions of our cars. We're never going to sign off on that. Like, Ferrari, obviously, as we know, is a very traditional brand, and they don't let anyone fuck with their stuff. I mean, even in GT Sport, there's no livery on like the Ferrari 458 GT3, you know, so they have their ways. But Lysette says that, you know, we're all expecting a straight out, no, we're not going to do this, that's ridiculous. But instead, they spent quite a lot of time with us designing paintwork and body kits to fit the cars as they'd done it themselves. So we wound up with something quite authentic. Then he goes on to say, what you normally get if you work with car manufacturers is that they're keen you don't show the car being damaged. But Ferrari's thought is that the spirit of the game is to go on the most beautiful journey in the most perfect weather, and the car is part of that journey. There's this preconception that car manufacturers tend to be quite prima donna-ish about it, but as long as you can explain to them the spirit and the ethos of what you're doing, generally you'll find they're quite supportive. And I think that going on the most beautiful journey in the most beautiful car in the most beautiful weather is that right there is what Outrun 2 is about. And so, you know, maybe it's no surprise that a company like Ferrari was so into this idea.
Yeah, absolutely. It suits their ethos down to a T, really. The stars of the show here are the cars just as much as the beautiful environments, because they just complement each other so damn well. I think that's exemplified by the fact that in 2006, which is the version I've been playing in prep for this podcast, you get two cars to start off with in that game. The 240 Dino, and I can't remember the other one.
356.
That's it, yeah, exactly. Sorry, my mind was totally blanking there. And, like, you're just looking at those two cars, and you'd be more than happy to play through the entirety of the game just between those two, because they're just two Ferraris that are very distinctly different in shape and poise and driving style as well to a certain extent. And it's just like the perfect intro to what the Ferraris are supposed to be in that game. We talked about the idea of hero cars. I think Outrun 2006, it isn't quite right to call them hero cars. It's definitely just that star power, though, that makes it feel like almost a Hollywood production. Just like it just completes the entire atmosphere of the game in a way that, say, a kind of generic made-up car couldn't. And I don't know, it just gives it that extra credibility of the experience in some strange way.
Absolutely. I mean, this game it's funny when you play it and you also think back to like Ferrari's, Formula One, team at the time, and Schumacher and Barrichello. And when you're driving these routes in Outrun 2 in 2006, you see Shell and AMD and Bridgestone billboards everywhere because they were like Ferrari's biggest partners. So this game is clad head to toe in Ferrari, and this is why I've always said that, like, I think that the way that you get around weird licensing issues is if you are so into the brand, and if you come to them with such a love for what they've built that you're able to convince Ferrari this is a celebration of Ferrari. It happens to be in a game that we've made, and Outrun, you would almost think that Ferrari would be kind of standoffish against Sega because the original game didn't license the Testarossa, because it was a thing kind of before licensing was really commonplace in the medium. But Ferrari understood that the Testarossa was going to be a hit either way, but Outrun really endeared it to a generation, a particular subset of fans, and they had Sega to thank for that, and Sega obviously had Ferrari to thank. So it was just kind of this mutual appreciation, I think, for what they both did. That's how you get a game like Outrun 2. And the way it found its way to home consoles is actually quite interesting because at this time, the game was designed for an arcade board called the Chihiro, which was essentially an Xbox with 128 megabits of RAM instead of 64. And so they basically had this game that was made essentially for an Xbox, just the slightly more powerful arcade version of it. And so it was always going to be a pretty, not an easy lift for a port. Nothing is necessarily easy, but it was well suited for the Xbox hardware. So naturally, that was where it ended up first. And this game released in arcades around the world in late 2003, like right at the end of 2003 in like November and December. And then a year later, you have the port that came to the Xbox in all regions and was developed by Sumo Digital. And this would be the start of a very close relationship between Sega and Sumo that honestly still goes to this day. The Sumo Digital is responsible for all of the Sega and Sonic All-Stars racing games and Team Sonic Racing, and the two entities. It's kind of like an unlikely romance, but it all started here with Outrun 2. And if you read interviews with Sumo personnel, they say like this was it. Like they were so happy with the accurate conversion that we were able to do with Outrun 2 that's how it led to games like Virtua Tennis falling under Sumo's purview. And Sumo is so good at this and proved to be so good at this early on that you would play the home ports of Outrun 2 and then 2006, and you would never think, if you hadn't seen the Sumo logo in the beginning of the game, you would think that Sega ported it themselves because it was done with that level of attention to detail.
So the thing is, Sumo are masters of the craft. They understand how to take an arcade title and put it on console. And the thing about that is it's not just in terms of getting it perfect the way Sega would have wanted it in terms of the representation on the console. but there's a different expectancy level from the audience there. They want a fully featured experience that not only has that incredible gameplay, but has other reasons to play on top of that, typically through a lot of content. And the finished version of Outrun 2006, the version that I played, you're talking like 30 locations in there, loads of Ferrari cars plus the Outrun models of those cars, the coast-to-coast modes, the dedicated mission mode, Heart Attack. Like, there's so many different ways to play a game which is effectively drifting a Ferrari around a never-ending road to a certain extent. But there's just so much to get stuck into, and it's put together so nicely that you would genuinely believe, like you were saying, Adam, like it wasn't actually Sumo that added a lot of this kind of additional content and window dressing. You would believe it came from Sega themselves, because they just get it right. They totally get zoned in on the vibe of what Outrun 2 was, improved that in 2006 with the addition of just so much more content. And I think the testament to how well they did in that regard is that I don't see many people asking for a new Outrun, but I do see a lot of people asking for 2006 to be remastered or re-released on future consoles, or the ones we've got now. Because, truth be told, I think Sumo hit it out of the park so much with their handling of this on console that there just isn't really much else you could add that would kind of merit a full new release in the series. So I think that kind of sums up just how well Sumo handled the project, and I can only imagine that Sega were absolutely buzzing with that as well.
Yeah, and Sega, it's kind of sad because you look at some of these interviews, Kikizo, an old website, I don't believe is around anymore, they interviewed some people from AM2. Well, actually, they interviewed AM2's Makoto Osaki and Kat Sato from Sega Europe, who Kat Sato shows up in a lot of stories. If you read about MSR, actually, he was sort of instrumental in forging the relationship with Bizarre Creations to get that game onto the Dreamcast. So, Sega understood at this time that this was a hard sell for a home product. And gone at this point, even by 2004, were the days of Sega Rally with 3 tracks and 3 cars, Daytona with, 3 or 4 tracks and 1 car. Like, they weren't, they knew that it was going to be a hard sell when, in the days where content was now king, and the quantity of that content, right? So, the interview actually that I found with Osaki takes a very interesting turn almost instantaneously. And Kikizo asked him, you expressed concern about the large rental and used game markets that exist in the West and how that might be an obstacle in bringing Outrun 2 home. Are you still worried about that, and will you be adding anything to the game to increase its longevity? And he said he was still worried about that, but Katsato and Sumo gave them a lot of ideas about what could be put into the Xbox version. I just, both on the level of like the cars and also like in the first release of Outrun 2 on Xbox, you had like those trading cards that were pretty cool.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you had Heart Attack mode and Time Trial and the mission mode. And also it had Xbox Live support. So, like, it's interesting that Sega took this game that, honestly, like, if you consider all of their racing games, I feel like Outrun 2 is probably the most... If you're gonna make that console game, it needs the most content, because it's not really a game that's based around racing, as we've said. And you have those 15 courses, sure, but they're very short. It's a game that's both weirdly very replayable, but also very limited at the same time. So, yeah. It would make sense that it was one of Sega's first concerns that, this game isn't going to translate well for a home audience. And I actually didn't realize this, but Outrun 2 was released as a sort of budget title in the US. It was $40 as opposed to $50, which was like the standard price of most Xbox games. So, yeah, Sega was aware of this, and Sumo understood that and brought a lot of things to the table. And, one of the things, not to get ahead of ourselves, but it was actually both Sumo and Sega kind of had the idea to add the Scud Race and Daytona 2 tracks to that original port of Outrun 2. Sumo kind of went to Sega and said, hey, you know, do you have anything that we could offer? And they were like, well, you could toss this in there. And, you know, you wouldn't say that 2 bonus tracks are really going to be a big difference. So like most casual players, they're going to make them go through the whole game for that. But obviously to any Sega arcade racing fan, you know, I knew that those tracks were in the game when I started playing, and I just knew I had to beat it so I could unlock them. It was the most important thing to me, and still I think it would rank as probably like the coolest bonus content that's ever been in a racing game.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially when you consider that in the case of Scud Race, and Daytona 2, I suppose, there was never a home console release, so that's like the closest you're getting to those tracks, really, especially in a gameplay format that it works really well in as well. I was always surprised at how well those tracks were to drive in the Outrun engine, and it's a shame they never actually carried over into 2006. Did we ever get a reason for that, Adam? I couldn't find anything specifically about why they didn't come across.
I think at that point, I couldn't find a reason, but I think it's just like once they had the Outrun SP courses in there, so you had a essential, you know, duplication of the content in that game, they just, you know, maybe they just wanted to focus on certain things, and it just wasn't in the cards. It is very unfortunate, but I mean that's kind of why, as much as I love 2006 because it has so much, like, the original Outrun 2 port's my favorite because you can just drive those tracks.
I think as well, it's just the technical prowess of the Xbox really does have that slight edge as well. It's not anything incredibly noticeable, but there's definitely I feel that the Xbox version shines a bit more. And then also just on the kind of cut content side of things as well, the Xbox release of Outrun 2 had the original game, didn't it, unlockable as well, whereas in 2006 that's gone.
Yes, it did, which I had completely forgotten about. And you know, in this day and age, those kinds of inclusions don't mean as much because, you know, of course we have the amazing M2 port and stuff like that, but at the time it was very, very cool. You know, I remember that was probably the first time I ever played the original Outrun when I was a kid, and you know, I very quickly found it harder than Outrun 2, which is kind of funny.
Exactly. I still really struggle with the original Outrun, to be honest. I've played so many of the ports across the years and I'm still absolutely trash at it.
Yeah, not an easy game at all. But yeah, I mean, Sumo was absolutely the right partner for this project, and actually, like, Sega was pretty hands off with them as they were, you know, converting Outrun 2. Basically, you know, they were told, make this as close, you know, make this essentially, you know, arcade perfect, and that's it. That's really all we want. You know, add the content, obviously, that needs to be added for its version of the game, but Sega wasn't sort of like, you know, constantly over their shoulder imposing things on them, and it seems like that made for a comfortable development environment, but also one that, you know, where they had a clear goal and they knew exactly what they wanted to do. It wasn't until the end of the process, it seems, that someone from AM2 came over and really played the game and did the QA testing to really make sure it was 100% accurate. They had an Outrun 2 cabinet in the office, so they were constantly going back and forth and comparing. But yeah, it's just, you know, it would make sense that, you know, just the most carefree fun racing game seemed to have a very not carefree development process, obviously, but just seemed to go that smoothly because, you know, Outrun 2 is a very simple game on the surface, and it's just, it's just purely enjoyable. So I just feel like that comes through when you hear these people talk about working on the game. You know, it wasn't really a thing that was like fraught with complexity. It was just like just make this game as fun and as pretty as possible.
I think that's the most incredible part, really, when you think about it, that level of confidence that Sega must have had in Sumo. right from the off, because it does seem as if they were able to just kind of do what they needed to do with the license and make what they felt would make it a full compelling console release. Because you think about the AM2 representative coming through the kind of latter stages of development, that could have been a very stressful time, and maybe it was just in that case that you've been left to your own devices for a lot of this, and someone could come over right away and say like, this part isn't right, and like then it could throw the whole project up there a bit. But obviously Sumo felt as if they understood the assignment well enough, so they were more than happy to crack on. Sega were also very happy to let them go ahead and do that. And it just seems like it was a match made in heaven, and that it results in a game that is just like absurdly playable and so brilliant to play from a technical perspective as well, because the version that I've been playing isn't even the PlayStation 2 version. I've been playing the PSP version for most of it, and like even with the kind of added benefit of some emulator stuff in there, because I've not been using actual hardware, PlayStation hardware to play it. It's still just it's an absolute marvel in the sense that it's so one-to-one for a lot of it in terms of what the PlayStation 2 version is like, and that's just a testament to what Sumo were able to offer, because you think about how many platforms they were developing this for, and it's a consistent great experience on all of them. I only wish I'd been able to play the kind of native PC version, which is something I've sadly never had the joy of experience.
Yeah, and this game made it onto everything, and that PSP port is very impressive, because you think about the fact that this game started on essentially a super-powered Xbox.
Yeah.
And they were able to condense it to PSP. Now, the PSP version does have, like, I've been playing it on my Vita, and it does have some issues in terms of maintaining a safe frame rate. If you're doing kind of singular runs, you know, where you're just like regular outrun mode, it's not too bad. But anytime you're doing a mission where there are other cars and they're drifting and they, you know, you see the smoke from their tires and stuff, the game does take quite a hit. But it's, I mean, at least on the Vita, because they kind of left it uncapped, if you are doing a time attack or something like that, I think it's 60 frames. Maybe not quite 60, but it feels really, really smooth. It's just when other cars kind of come into the mix that things really slow down, and then you feel like it's 30 or worse.
There definitely is scenarios, there are scenarios where it seems to hit that 60 mark, because you immediately notice that smoothness, and it's like, oh, where did that come from? And then it'll kind of dip a little bit again, and yeah, like you're saying, it's not perfect, but it's not like Sega Rally 2 on Dreamcast levels of variation here. It's very much for the type of game it is as well. It doesn't intrude the experience. Maybe sometimes you get that weird, like almost like an elastic band effect, where you kind of feel as if you can see the frame rate changing in real time almost, and it looks odd visually, but it's nothing that really kind of removes the experience. And like you say, you start from that supercharged Xbox, and you work your way down to all these different platforms, and they still all offer a very good experience of the game, and one that, especially back in the days of the PSP's prime, like, what a joyful game to have on the go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was probably my favorite PSP game, because, you know, here it really did not sacrifice anything to the console versions. I mean, hey, like, if you're talking about Outrun 2006 versus 2, you have essentially double the tracks, you have a lot more cars. So I actually, back in the day, I had Outrun 2 for the original Xbox, but when it came time to get 2006, I got it for the PSP, because that was a platform where I was really going to, you know, the ability to take a game like that on the road was fantastic. And you also talk about, like, the music too. I mean, Outrun music is beloved by people who don't even care about Outrun or racing games. And so in addition to those classic 3 tracks, you have, and then this applies to the arcade version too, you have songs that honestly to me mean even more, like Shiny World and Risky Ride. And these console versions had sort of Euro remixes by Richard Jacques, and they had classic tracks as well. You had like the original 3, like the 1986 Magical Sound Shower and stuff like that. You had songs from like Turbo Outrun, my personal favorite being Rush of Difficulty. The only, there are some games in the history of the franchise, like Outrunners had an amazing soundtrack. Those songs don't really appear in these games, but a very sort of eclectic mix of all these different kind of takes on these beloved songs. And in 2006 you could even there were something that weren't necessarily unlocked from the start. You had to buy them, which I always thought was pretty cool. And it's just a great celebration of what these games are all about. And that's one of the things I think with Outrun. It's one of those games that musically it's so important to experience, like an R4, for example, or something like that or Wipeout, that when I just hear those songs, I have a Spotify playlist, and luckily Sega's uploaded the entire Outrun discography to Spotify, so I'll just put those on. I mean, Brendan, we were driving, early last year when we were going out to Largs. We put the Outrun soundtrack on, and it was perfect.
Yeah, absolutely, and don't get me wrong, that trip was in a Peugeot 308, not quite a Ferrari Testarossa or otherwise, but it was still good fun. But yeah, from a music point of view, you were saying Rush A Difficulty makes the cut, and then it just so happens that my favourite as well, Keep Your Heart from Turbo Outrun, makes the cut. And I think that's the thing that's really interesting about the music selection. It's just so wide and varied, because listen, we know it's easy to default to Splash, Wave and Magical Sound Shower. They're fantastic, even Risky Ride as well, phenomenal songs. But Outrun 2006 is a great way to be introduced to all these other songs from the many different releases and the confusingly named games that aren't part of the main series. There's just so many tracks in here, and in classic Sumo fashion as well, as far as attention to detail goes. They do really cool things as well. If it's the original versions of the songs, they'll make the songs play through the radio as if they're coming through a radio, as stupid as that sounds. They add that little bit of kind of fuzziness to the music, and it just it's not over the top, so you're I understand what they're doing there, but it's if you just listen closely, you can hear that the music isn't quite as crisp as the Outrun 2 versions or the Euro remixes. And it's just little touches like that as well that make the music in the game absolutely phenomenal. They're obviously when I played through it when I was younger, I just couldn't see past the Euro remixes because I thought they were so cool, so it was always those that I would choose. But obviously, as I've got a bit older, I've actually started just enjoying having some of the more kind of slower chilled ones in there, and I think that's the cool thing about the remixes as well, because obviously in a game like Outrun you could just make it so every single remix is kind of cranked to the max, techno versions of all the songs, but they don't go down that route. For a lot of these songs, the remixes are actually maybe a bit slower paced than the originals, such as Keep Your Heart, because the Outrun 2 version of that song and the remix version is definitely a much different vibe to the original, but it just works perfectly. And we talked about the Ferraris feeling perfect in the Outrun 2 experience, and the music also just encapsulates that. There's just everything about this game, and I know this doesn't all go on Sumo's shoulders, it obviously goes down to AM2 as well, but it's just the experience just feels so perfectly polished that there are very little parts of it you can call out beyond maybe not enjoying the physics as much as you would like to and that type of thing. The actual core experience they're trying to create here and what they put on console is just such a thrilling experience, and it's honestly a fantastic way to hear these songs. To tie it back to the main topic we're discussing here, I feel as if this is a greatest hits almost of Outrun, and the songs they've chosen are absolutely perfect.
100%. Yeah, and it's funny too, because that M2 port that we got of the original Outrun has those extra songs that were just made, newly.
Oh yeah.
And it's funny because those songs have become such a part of sort of the Outrun lineage to me that when I go back and play 2006 and they're not there, Cruising Line and Camino and stuff, it's disappointing. But I guess that's why we need another port of Outrun 2. But the one thing that I wanted to call out, one last thing from these interviews that struck me as super interesting was Sumo is working on porting these games, and they're trying to find ways of sort of expanding the content. So naturally, a way that you would do that with an arcade racing game, is to provide reverse or mirrored versions. And they realized early on that they wanted to do this with Outrun 2. So there's just this fantastic exchange with Paul Porter and Darren Mills from Sumo, where they talk about how these tracks are built, and that you can't take a free camera to them because part of the reason they look so good on this old hardware, part of the reason that the PSP version looks, aside from resolution, just as good as the Xbox or PS2 versions, is because the games were actually very optimized to the field of view that the player had, and that's why you can't turn around in Outrun 2 or 2006, and there's no replay mode, and these were things that didn't really I never thought about until I read this interview. So I'm just going to go through some of the things that they say. And Paul Porter says that it's built like a film set. As long as you've got the camera pointed in the right direction, everything looks perfect and pristine. But if you allowed the camera to turn around at all, you would see that everything is just cardboard faces. And then he says, I'll never forget when we wanted to add more content to the game. One of the things we wanted to do was reverse the tracks. The look on the Japanese faces. You want to reverse the tracks? Are you crazy? We were like, oh, well, we'll just change the chevrons and it'll be, no, you won't. And then you look at the track and you say, so we're going to have to reposition everything. So yeah, what I really want to do, because I know we have guys like Admeister and Pez2K and really talented people in the Time Extend community who just deconstruct these old racing games. I don't know what it would take to get a free camera into Outrun 2 or 2006, but I really want to see somebody do it and just be able to turn it around and just see nothing. These one-dimensional buildings and stuff, because that's got to be just really funny.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you, I wouldn't have even thought about it this way, but it does make sense now, because you think about the technical constraints a lot of games were facing at that time, and then you compare it to how stunning like Outrun 2 looks. It all makes sense now. I just, oh man, that description as well about when they suggested reversing the tracks. Oh man, I would love to see what going in reverse one of those tracks would look like. It must be an absolute hill, laugh.
Yeah.
It must be.
So they were able to do it. They in 2006, I can't remember if Outrun 2 had reverse tracks, but 2006 obviously does.
Yeah, they did it, yeah.
So I guess they did just kind of turn everything around. But later in the interview, Mills says that, it was a nightmare when we did reverse the tracks. They weren't built to have bunkies going the other way. Now, bunkies was, I guess a bunkie is the Japanese word for the junctions. So he says that you were supposed to drive around the corner and onto the track, not off the track into a long straight. It took some real work. Yeah. You'd find that when you reverse the track, you would come off of a track backwards onto a junction section, and then as the new section was loading in, it was loading in over the junction you were driving on because everything was pointed in the wrong direction. Just these logistical sort of nightmares or just unforeseen consequences. There's a lot. This is such a great interview because there's a lot of discussion, both directly and indirectly, about the differences in Japanese game design as opposed to Western game design or UK game design. And these guys are talking about how the I don't know if the Japanese way or just the way that AM2 did for Outrun 2, but they were set on only rendering and just optimizing the experience for everything you could see. And the things that you couldn't see, they just hid, because that allowed the journey ahead, which is all that Outrun is about, to be as beautiful and as smooth and seamless as possible. Whereas like a Western developer might have made those other sides of the rock or the tree or the mountain or something that normally would be invisible to the player. And I think it's a really interesting discussion. I remember, as a really quick aside, when I studied abroad in the UK and I went to University of Sussex for a semester. I took a 3D modeling course, and it's the only 3D modeling I ever did. But the professor was he would talk about how, don't waste your time, because at the end of the semester we basically had to submit a JPEG of the scene we created in like Autodesk, and he was like, don't waste your time rendering things that will not be visible in the JPEG. Like, only model half of the spaceship that can be seen. Only model half of the planet that can be seen, and stuff like that. And it's when you read things like this and you go through experiences like that you realize, like, wow, there's so much smoke and mirrors when it comes to design. And I just find that stuff fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. It's masters of the craft at work, and obviously you're getting to see a bit behind the scenes in terms of that assignment. It is funny because I think from a mindset point of view, having to model half of a visible spaceship is probably more difficult than doing the full spaceship, because you're like almost trying to code your brain to like make something that shouldn't really make sense but make it look twice as good as the thing it would look like if it was the full spaceship in view. So I can only imagine in the case of the original Outrun, or Outrun 2006 as well, I suppose, actually trying to get into that mindset of only work on what we can see but still make it look as if the other part is there in some capacity. Like, it's an interesting challenge, and I think like as we move on in games development, it seems to be that fidelity is the main focus in terms of making things look incredible with the power that's available. Whereas I think back even in the PS2 Xbox era, it was like, how can we balance fidelity with that feeling of like a complete world? Because we can't just render every object indefinitely, because it would just fucking take up all the computational resources. It's interesting to get that little bit of insight, because when you look at this game and see it in motion, your first thought isn't, I bet that isn't actually modelled on the rear arse of it or whatever. It's like, that looks incredible.
It's amazing how they were able to design these tracks that, the draw distances are phenomenal in this game. You look at some tracks like Cloudy Highlands or the one that's on the snowy mountain. You can see so far. And then you think about some other tracks like the forest or... God, I'm forgetting some of their names, but they're tighter and they're more intricate, and you can't see as far. And this game does both of those environments really well. Our last episode we had Paul Lavelle on. We were talking about his experience as a level designer in Colin McRae 3, 4, and 5, and he was comparing what they had done to, or what they were able to do to, the WRC games that Evolution Studios is making, and how they weren't able to provide the same draw distances that the Evo engine could, but they were focused on developing a more richly intricate experience in those tight stages. And Outrun 2, again, it's not something that we really think about today, because game development doesn't have these problems that it used to have. It has different problems, but to be able to just see into the horizon forever. It's hard for me to put myself back in the mindset of being a kid and seeing that for the first time, but it was really jaw-dropping, to start out in Sunny Beach, or whatever it's called, and see the water going on for miles and miles and the reflection of the sun. These are still beautiful games, and, whether you're playing on a PSP or, a PSP emulator or an Xbox or a PlayStation 2, it comes across.
Yeah, absolutely, and everybody's got those certain stages, I think, that's like permanently burned into their brain as a beauty moment in this game. For me personally, like the Aztec Ruins level and the Snowy Alpine one we were talking about are just like so meticulously crafted, it's beautiful. But then there are individual moments in other stages as well, such as when you come over like the kind of the curve at the top of the hill looking down to the massive waterfall where the hairpin is, and there's just so many beautiful moments in this game, and almost hearing that they've been crafted in this manner makes me appreciate them even more, because it just adds to that kind of Hollywood aesthetic the game almost has. Just like that, this is too perfect to be real life, and I'm more than happy to accept that. Like the the brightness of the colours and the actual colour palette itself as well. You think about how this game looked in comparison to what was becoming the kind of hyper-realistic trend of games at that point. Like, games were definitely more trending towards the more kind of dark, gritty colour schemes. But like Outrun 2 and Outrun 2006 just like absolutely scream arcade racer, and it's a term like the whole blue sky Sega thing. It's a bit of a myth for me, but like if a game was going to have that aesthetic, like Outrun definitely personifies it in this entry, because there is not one like screenshot of this game that you could look at and be like, oh, that looks pretty drab. Like, there's always at least the burning bright red Ferrari, all the incredible visuals in the background, or just even the HUD as well. Like, when you're getting heart attack requests and stuff, it's just so like beautifully in your face, and it's just an absolutely perfect game in that regard.
Yeah, and I think, you know, with 2006 lacking those Daytona and Scud Race tracks, there were always the you know, courses that I went to kind of give me back some of that feeling. And like the Metropolis, I believe it's called, and the what's the other one? Casino Town, yeah, and SP. Like those tracks are just, to me, those are peak Scud Race. So, you know, their circuits or their locations, I always make sure to hit. And they remind me of other games, whether they're Sega or not. Like, the hardest stage in the original Outrun 2 is Cape Way. And that's, like, kind of on the, you know, the coast of the Mediterranean in Greece or something, right? So it reminds me so much of, like, Costa di Amalfi in Gran Turismo 4, or the Mediterranean tracks in Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2. Just the breadth of the environments, I mean, that's what Outrun is all about. Right, because you can experience pretty much every biome that exists in the world in these games, but I think everybody has that ideal, that favorite route that they do. Even, you know, I was talking with some people in the Discord today, and somebody said that they absolutely hated skyscrapers, which is tough. But like, even the ones that are hard, it's always enjoyable to go through them, because it's like, you know, it was just in the jungle, or I was just in, you know, the middle of Egypt and seeing pyramids, and, you know, now I'm on the Brooklyn Bridge. It's an experience that only Outrun can provide. So if we're talking about games, if we're talking about the journey, you know, there is obviously a reason why these games have stood the test of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, like, in terms of the actual gameplay itself as well, I think we've kind of alluded to it throughout, but like, for me, like, I don't really look at this as a racing game at all, to be honest. All power to those that play it as such, but anytime I used to play the online versions of the game, like Outrun Online Arcade, I suppose, same lineage, I would always just be shocked at the amount of people trying not to drift so hard so they could take the corners that little bit faster and stuff. Like, that, you can play games however you want, of course, but that just escapes me. Like, I've always felt Outrun's that nice balance between how to get to the end within the time limit while still looking stylish as fuck while you're doing it, and that kind of race other drivers side of it, where people could be that trying to basically game the system almost. I've just never really got on with that. For me, it was always just about the kind of mission mode stuff. I think the heart attack stuff's still phenomenal. Like, I love how it goes from like, oh yeah, your girlfriend wants to see you drift around a corner, and then like 2 stages later it's like, don't get abducted. Like, yeah, I love how
the special
it
requests,
just like it escalates like that. Yeah,
they're insane.
Exactly, and dribble the beach ball around a corner while drifting and stuff. Like, it's just
some
absolutely
of those are
brilliant.
So hard to do too. Like, those are difficult. The hit all the ghosts, and I think that's my one complaint about Outrun 2. Is that it's just not the kind of handling model that comes naturally to me. Like, you know, I love games where I'm drifting and stuff like that. Like, that's fun. You know, drifting is fun for me in Daytona. It's fun for me in certain Ridge Racer games. But the handling in Outrun 2 is very stiff and very heavy. And I think that, you know, the stages in this game are all designed to accommodate that handling model. But it leads to a lot of frustration doing the heart attack mode, and also some of them like have really, really tough corners. Like, I'll always remember there's like I think Coniferous Forest is pretty bad about this, and Canyon is pretty bad too. There's this one really tight right-hander on Canyon where like you're kind of coming up a hill, you're going over a crest, and you really can't see it until you're there, and you just inevitably slide into a wall. And like, you know, I'm not saying the game needs to be easy and always make it easy to negotiate these corners, but like that's a situation where I'll always feel like if the handling in this game was a little bit tighter, and you know the drifting was there was more nuance to it instead of just carry on forever. If it handled more like say Daytona USA 2, then I would have been able to get around that corner and have fun doing it. But you know, that's just why Outrun 2 is just not. There's no handling model you can compare it to, you know, and that's why this game is so distinctive. And I don't necessarily dislike it for that. I just kind of appreciate it for what it is and how it's different from all those other games. Because it really is a different experience. Like growing up, I didn't really play manual with a lot of racing games, but Outrun 2 makes it so easy because really the only time you ever need to shift is when you're entering the corner. You'll downshift and then upshift, and at that point, it's not even like Daytona where you have to think like, okay, I'm going from fourth gear to second gear. Like you just go down a gear and you're sideways in Outrun. So it's pretty easy to drive manual in this game if you're someone who's not used to doing it, and you need to if you want to get some of those faster times. But again, like you were saying, Brendan, being a tryhard was never. It isn't my intention in most games, but like in Outrun, it really isn't. It's just not like what I come to this game for.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, well, you're an absolute phenom at Crazy Taxi, for example.
That's the only one.
Example of a game, but that's like an example of a game where it's like intrinsic to enjoying that game to the maximum is getting incredible at it. I would say, like getting that ability to get really good at the game. Whereas, as we've talked about throughout, like with Outrun, I feel as if anybody of any skill level can enjoy it. And I feel as if if you try to go to that same extent that some Sega racers almost encourage in terms of getting absolutely masterful at it, it just feels as if you're applying a science to what is effectively a piece of art, in the sense that I feel as if Outrun 2/2006 is there to be enjoyed and marvelled at. I've never felt that inclination to somehow get incredible or great at it, because I just feel as if that strips away the magic quality that it has, that it just whisks you away. That's it.
100%. And, the good thing about Outrun 2 is that, unlike a lot of old racing games, there are a good number of ways to play it today. It would be great to have a port, and to be brutally honest with you, I don't think that you could ever really count out a port of Outrun 2 to any hardware, because yes, it's old, and you would think that maybe Ferrari would want to show off some like newer models and stuff, but I think this game is such a singular achievement that I would not be surprised if we just learned that they were going to bring it back and had Ferrari's full backing and everything. But until that day comes, there are a number of ways to play the game. Not so much on new hardware, although if you have a PC, there's this wonderful emulator called Technoparrot where you can play Outrun 2 SP, which is basically the delineation there is that 2006 was essentially the home port of SP, and SP is Outrun 2 but with like double the tracks. So that would be your way of playing the arcade version at any resolution you want, at any frame rate you want, and it's just a gorgeous experience. But if you want to use regular hardware, Brendan, you were saying you were playing on a tablet, I think, playing the PSP version. There are the 2006 ports of Xbox, and on Xbox and PS2. There's the original Outrun 2 port on the Xbox, and the PSP version again is great. So there are lots of different ways to play this game that I'm sure the people listening, if they haven't already, can figure out. And yeah, it's not too hard, thankfully.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, if all the games maybe to get that revival. There's just something about Outrun 2 and its many other versions that it just has that kind of re-release ability, I think, that wouldn't require too much effort as well, because in the case of me on this emulator, I've been playing the PSP version with 10 times upscaled textures, and it looks amazing. It looks so fucking good. So you can only imagine that, well, if Ferrari want to throw models like the LaFerrari in there or whatever, then fair enough. I'd happily take them if they're offering it. But who knows what the situation with licensing is these days in racing games, because for every one that we think shouldn't be that difficult, we have heard the stories and we hear the references about how certain licenses and getting things through the kind of the door now is just that little bit harder for whatever reason. So sadly, even though it would be great to have, you do understand that those are the challenges. But thankfully, as you're saying, Adam, there's just so many different ways to experience this game and its many different kind of outfits. So it's not as if it's incredibly hard to find or anything like that. It is definitely worth experiencing though, and it's really one of a kind. And it only makes me sad that we didn't get any Sumo Digital developed ports of Scud Race and things like that, because I definitely feel as if there's evidence here to suggest that those guys would have knocked that out of the park as well.
Yeah, definitely. In one of those interviews, actually, Damien McFerrin, who I think runs, not runs, but is a, one of the more prominent editors at the Nintendo Life, he had an old interview with someone from Sumo and was asking like, hey, were you guys ever, working on a Scud Race or a Daytona that ever come up? And they were just like, no, we poured those tracks, but that was basically it. But yeah, Sumo clearly has a deep understanding. And I mean, we have to talk about, not really go into it because honestly I can't remember because it was so long ago, but Outrun even had a track in Sega All-Stars Transformed, right?
It did. It did indeed. Yeah, Outrun Bay. Yeah. Which, instead of taking that famous left-hander that led to the tiny hill before the junction, you take a right-hander through the beach onto the waters and then turn into a boat and get to drive alongside the yachts that are docked at the bay before arriving back just before the start line again. So it's a different way of doing that track, but that is amazing because it includes a version of the Outrun Bay Splashwave Euro remix, but it's also infused with dubstep for some reason. It's
it was 2010.
A very odd remix, yeah. So 2010s, yeah. And the power of that Euro remix still comes through, and it's very listenable, but it is definitely an odd experience. But like you say, it's one of those ones as well where, if I recall, I'm pretty sure Flagman almost ended up a character and Transformed as well. I think I read that somewhere. Yeah. He was on a short list for one of the DLC characters that ended up being Football Manager instead.
Which is hilarious.
Yeah, that is hilarious. One of the small things I like about 2006, I might as well bring it up now, is like when you beat Flagman, like the missions tagged Flagman, it comes up like Flagman has been completed, on to Flagman 2. It's like that weird like wording was always like, okay, is this guy just like took over this guy's job and he's been decommissioned, or
the sequel
what's going on here?
And I'd like to remind people that if you have that PS3 or that 360 lying around, you can, provided you bought Online Arcade, which was the HD port of SP, and kind of 2006. It doesn't have all the content because that was back in the days where like Xbox Live Arcade games needed to be under like 250 megs or something, so they were really tight for space. But if you have those old consoles and you purchase them back in the day, because obviously they've long since been delisted, you can still play them. I fired up a 360 and re-downloaded it and was playing that a couple months ago, early in the pandemic. So yeah, there, if you know where to look there, and I'm sure there are also ways that you could get a hacked 360 or PS3 and play it. I have no idea how that works, but there's probably a way you can do it.
It's really interesting as well, like Outrun Online Arcade, because it released in 2009 and then it was taken down from PSN in 2010 and then subsequently Xbox Live Arcade in December 2011. it's almost like Sumo just wanted to kind of get this out the door to get another Outrun game out there, like before that license expired, because it's such a short period of time for that game to be available.
Yeah, that's like Scott Pilgrim. That game was delisted, famously, relatively quickly, but I think it made it longer than a year. A year is a very short time. And the same thing basically happened to Sega Rally Online Arcade too. So yeah, those, it's one of those things, like, with the right person, if you list it on eBay, like, 360 or PS3 with like Sega Rally and Outrun Online Arcade, most people will not care. But if you were to find someone like us, we would pay top dollar. It's like one of those PS4s that has PT on it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you had a PlayStation 3 console with Sega Rally Online Arcade, Outrun Online Arcade, and GTI Club on the PS3, like, that's like the holy trifecta of PSN racers that are just like lost to time. And have you played GTI Club?
I have.
I think we might have talked about this
so
before, yeah.
GTI Club, I got GTI Club Plus, or whatever the hell it was called, back in the day on my PS3. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think at a certain point I switched accounts. So I have an account somewhere with GTI Club on it, but it's not the one I use anymore. And it was a good game. I don't feel compelled to really go back and find it. But I don't know if the PSP or the Wii version is basically better, or if you would really want to go back and make sure you get that PS3 one.
Yeah, it's an odd scenario. Obviously, we don't want to derail the podcast here, but like, it's very confusing. So GTI Club Plus is a remake of the original arcade game, but brought up to date with brand new visuals, lock 60 frame rate, blah blah blah, some new cars.
Also by Sumo, right?
Yeah, also by Sumo, yeah. And then
I forgot about that.
Super Manifesta is the arcade game that was brought out in the late 2000s, and so it's like almost a sequel to the original arcade cabinet, but the Wii and PSP versions are based off of that rather than the original game that GTI Club Plus was off of. So I'm not sure what Konami was smoking that they decided to do it that way, but yeah, it's funnily enough Sumo. Yeah, I totally forgot it was them that did that as well.
Yeah, they were, they were basically making all the arcade racing game revivals. So they missed out on Ridge Racer, but otherwise they were there. Damn, now I want to play GTI Club.
We need to find a way to get an episode on that if we can locate that account that's been long gone the test of time.
Well, real quick, is the PSP one good, or?
Yeah, the PSP and Wii ones are actually really enjoyable. They're very similar to the Penny Racers games as well, depending on how much you've played them, or Gadget Racers, or however many names those games had. So those ones have a lot more content, and there's some fun mini games like car football and stuff. So there's some like pre-Rocket League stuff in there. Those games are good as well, to be honest, and they're a lot easier to find. I know in Europe, physical copies of that game on the Wii, goes for like £95 plus, because it was like such a limited release. So that's an oddity in itself.
I'm sure there's a way I can just get it on my Vita, because I have the jailbroken Vita. But
yeah. Wow,
there was a GTI Club 2. I never knew about this.
Yep,
a sequel in 2000. Wow, GTI Club is a game I honestly didn't even know existed until I played the PSN version. Like I played that, and then only after that discovered that there was an original arcade game from like the mid-90s, and just totally been lost to time. But yeah, I guess now we have to do a GTI Club episode.
Yep, add it to the list of how many episodes we've got to get through.
All right, well, it's been fun talking about Outrun, and these are obviously fantastic games, and it's good that we could finally do it justice with the podcast and get back to Sega Racing, which is always my favorite topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, given it's our favourite topic and we have covered it so extensively, it's funny that there's still so many other Sega Racers we've got to talk about, so it won't be the last time we talk about a Sega Racer, that's for sure.
Definitely. So Everyone, thanks for listening. As always, like to put a message at the end of the show that if you're listening to this and you are not involved in the Time Extend Discord, please reach out to us, message the Twitter account time_extend, and we'll just give you an invite for you and your friends. It's just that simple. So, come talk about cool racing games with us, and yell at Fernando for his love of Enthusia or something. It's pretty much a tradition at this point.
Yep, it's a ritual. Shout at Fernando for liking Enthusia, and also ensure that you've played Shocks before asking to join. I'm kidding. You don't have to have played Shocks, but it would help you.
There's when you join the server, there's a terms and service, and two of the terms of service is you have to give Fernando crap for liking Enthusia, and you also have to play Shocks. No, not really, but thinking about it now, it sounds pretty funny.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks everybody for listening to this episode, and we will be back again one day, sometime.
Thanks for listening, guys.